Every time you say the word candidate, you're describing someone who once dressed in brilliant white. In ancient Rome, men running for office would whiten their togas with chalk until they gleamed like fresh snow, transforming themselves into walking advertisements for their own purity. The Latin word candidatus literally meant whitened, and that ghostly figure from 2000 years ago is still haunting our elections today. This isn't just etymological trivia. The connection between political power and performing purity runs so deep in Western culture that we barely notice it anymore. When Hillary Clinton wore white to accept the Democratic nomination in 2016, when suffragettes marched in white dresses, when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez chose a white suit for her swearing-in, they were all speaking in a symbolic language with ancient roots. But here's what's unsettling. That same symbolism has been weaponizing the idea of purity in politics for over 2 millennia, and we're still falling for it. Today, we're going to trace how a piece of clothing became a political statement, how the Romans basically invented political theater as we know it, and why the word candidate reveals something uncomfortable about how we still think about who deserves power. Let's start in Rome, around 100 BCE. Picture the Forum Romanum on election day, not the ruins you see today, but a bustling marketplace of democracy, the air's thick with dust, sweat, and ambition. And moving through the crowd like ghosts are the candidates, their togas so white they're almost blinding in the Mediterranean sun. This wasn't fashion, this was strategy. The toga candida, the whitened toga, was created by applying chalk, or creta, to the wool until it achieved an otherworldly brightness. The process was so labor-intensive that only the wealthy could afford it. A slave would spend hours working the chalk into every fold, ensuring that when their master walked through the forum, he would literally shine. But why white? The Romans had two different words for white: albus, which meant plain white, and candidus, which meant brilliant, gleaming white. Candidus came from the verb candere, to shine, to glow. It's the same root that gives us candor, candor, and incandescent. The Romans weren't just choosing a color, they were choosing radiance itself. The symbolism was deliberate. White represented puritas, not just cleanliness, but moral purity. It suggested that the candidate's character was as spotless as his toga. In a political system drowning in corruption, bribery, and violence, the white toga was a visual promise. I am different. I am clean. Ancient sources describe how candidates would arrive at dawn to begin their day of campaigning, their white togas fresh from the chalk treatment. They'd position themselves in the most visible parts of the forum, where the morning light would catch their garments and make them glow like beacons. The effect was so striking that ordinary citizens would literally follow the white figures through the crowd. But here's the first twist: the system was completely corrupt. These men in white were often the most ruthless politicians in Rome. Julius Caesar, who certainly wore the toga candida during his campaigns, would later cross the Rubicon and destroy the Republic. Marcus Crassus, another frequent candidate, was so wealthy he once said no man could call himself rich unless he could afford his own army. These weren't pure men, they were masters of political theater. The Romans had essentially perfected visual political messaging 2,000 years before modern media. The white toga wasn't about actual virtue, it was about performing virtue, and it worked so well that the very word for political candidate became permanently linked to this costume drama. The Roman tradition of white as purity didn't just disappear when the empire fell, it went underground, morphing through centuries of Christian symbolism, royal pageantry, and eventually women's rights movements. Jump forward to 1908, London. The Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, makes a crucial decision about their movement's colors. They choose purple for dignity, gold for hope, and white for purity. But this wasn't the same kind of purity the Romans were selling. The suffragettes were reclaiming the symbol, turning it from a tool of male political theater into a weapon of female resistance. Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, one of the movement's leaders, wrote in 1908, "White, the emblem of purity, symbolizes the quality of our purpose." But read between the lines, the suffragettes weren't claiming to be pure in some Victorian sense of feminine virtue. They were claiming that their cause was pure, uncorrupted by the political machinery that had excluded them for centuries. When thousands of suffragettes marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, they wore white dresses that caught the light like armor. Newspapers described the effect as ghostly and ethereal, but these weren't ghosts. They were revolutionaries using the visual language of purity to demand power. Here's what's brilliant about this appropriation. The suffragettes understood that white carried moral authority in Western culture, but they stripped away its association with submissive femininity. Instead of white as innocence, they made it white as righteousness. Instead of white as purity that needed protection, they made it white as purity that demanded justice. But the Roman connection runs deeper than symbolism. The suffragettes were also claiming the right to be candidates, literally to be the whitened ones. In a political system that had excluded women since ancient Rome, putting on white was a way of saying, we belong in the forum too. This reveals something profound about political language. When Shirley Chisholm wore white to announce her presidential campaign in 1972, when Geraldine Ferraro wore white to accept the vice presidential nomination in 1984, when Hillary Clinton wore white to the 2016 debates, they weren't just making fashion statements, they were speaking in a political vocabulary that stretched back to the Roman Forum, but they were conjugating it differently. Except, here's the uncomfortable truth, the symbolism still carries its original baggage. Every time a politician chooses white to signal virtue, they're reinforcing the idea that moral authority has a particular visual language, and that language has been associated with power, with cleanliness, with political legitimacy for over 2,000 years. This brings us to the most disturbing part, how the candidatus tradition reveals the deep structure of political symbolism that we're still trapped in today. Consider what happened during the 2020 Democratic National Convention. Female delegates coordinated to wear white while Kamala Harris accepted the vice presidential nomination. The visual was striking, a sea of white-clad women supporting the first black woman on a major party's presidential ticket. But think about the symbolism at work here. To claim political legitimacy, these women felt compelled to dress in the color of Roman political theater. The irony is profound. Harris accepting a nomination that would have been unthinkable to the Romans who invented the word candidate was surrounded by supporters wearing the color that Roman candidati used to signal their worthiness for power. The very symbol being used to celebrate inclusion was born from a system of radical exclusion. But here's what's even more revealing. The word candidate has completely lost its connection to clothing, yet the clothing hasn't lost its connection to candidacy. We no longer think about togas when we hear candidate, but we still think about white when we see political virtue being performed. This linguistic evolution tells us something crucial about how political symbols work. They don't disappear when their original context vanishes, they burrow deeper, becoming unconscious assumptions about what power looks like. The Romans may be gone, but their visual vocabulary for political legitimacy is still shaping how we see democracy. And this matters more than you might think. When Democratic strategists reportedly said in 2024 that their 2028 candidate has to be a white guy, they weren't just talking about race and gender, they were unconsciously channeling 2,000 years of assumptions about what a candidatus should look like. The toga may be gone, but the idea that political purity has a particular appearance remains embedded in our political DNA. The word candidate is a fossil of Roman political theatre, but it's a living fossil. Every election cycle, we watch politicians try to perform the same kind of moral purity that Roman candidati were selling with their chalk whitened togas. They use different costumes now, flag pins, rolled up sleeves, carefully casual attire, but they're still trying to solve the same problem. How to make voters believe they're different from all the other politicians. The Romans understood something we've forgotten. Politics is performance, and performance requires costume. The toga candida was brilliant political technology because it made virtue visible. But it was also a lie because virtue can't be worn like clothing. The candidates who gleamed brightest in the forum were often the ones who would burn the republic down. Every time we use the word candidate, we're speaking Latin without knowing it. We're invoking a tradition of political theatre that stretches back to the Roman Forum, where men in chalk white togas competed for power by performing purity. That performance was a lie then, and it's a lie now, but it's a lie we keep telling because we haven't figured out a better way to choose our leaders than watching them dress up and pretend to be virtuous. The Romans gave us the word candidate, but they also gave us the problem it represents. In a world where everyone claims to be pure, how do you tell who's actually clean?